Good morning. It's an absolute pleasure, a privilege, and honesty would compel me to say it's no small measure of self-indulgence to be back here again. And the self-indulgence is going to be featured in the amazing lineup of people that we have for you today. This man here often says, when he's interviewing people, he asks them, when were those notes of music first dropped into your ear? And what we hope to drop into your ear today is the tidings of a future which is not an inevitability. It can't be precisely forecasted. It, at this stage, needs to be neither accepted nor defended against, but it mostly needs to be imagined into being. And what we will have up here today is a series of storytellers, performers, thinkers, technologists, engineers, activists, today and tomorrow, who are going to help us imagine that into being. And the lady that I'm going to introduce to you next, you're going to see her on the screens behind me. She was standing in this podium here last year, Professor Genevieve Bell. She's a true one of a kind. I'm not really going to introduce her because she does that for herself and she will do it to a better extent than what I can do. But she is a real one-off. She also says that when she was here last year, she was in somewhat of an existential crisis as to what she should do next in her life. We would like to believe that in some small part, we helped edge her towards the choices that she subsequently made. And what she's going to do over the course of the next 40 minutes is tell us about some of the choices that she's making. She has gone back to her home place of Australia, and she is not only imagining, but bringing into being a new applied science with which to shepherd this new world into being. She has some remarkable things to tell us, and I will leave that story to her. When she was here last year, though, too, we asked her to explore the notion of an edge. So we have presented it at many times as an edge, as a distinguishing feature, an advantaging feature, a differentiating feature. She asked us to explore it at 3 different levels. The first, obviously, always to understand the edge as being in relation to a centre, but that what's often forgot is that the centre itself is always shifting, and the notions at that centre are always shifting. The second thing she said, and I think it's a meaning, a resonance that we can immediately emotionally resonate with, is the edge as a liminal place. A place in between where the work of translation, the work of transition gets done, where mutual misunderstanding between different groups is often a key feature. She said the language that you often hear at the place of an edge is, when they said that, they meant that. No, they didn't mean that. And that's the work that gets done at the edge. The third notion of edge that she asked us to consider was the possibility to ask different questions at an edge, to use a different vantage point. And I suppose what she said really constituted a challenge to us as we looked at these series of future possibilities, that there was a space for leadership and for contribution in terms of edginess, and that if Ireland was brave enough and bold enough, that perhaps that potential for leadership existed for us there. She has certainly taken her own advice. She's gone home to Australia, as I said, and she is bringing that new way of looking at this world, this new way of integrating disciplines, cross-sectional thinking into being. And that's what she's going to describe for us now in the next 40 minutes. So I'm just going to hand over to Genevieve, who's going to be behind me.
to know about me. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training and by birth. I grew up on my mother's field sites in central and northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. I spent most of my childhood running around without shoes, speaking another language, and getting to kill things. And I always have to add I ate them afterwards, because otherwise I sound like I might have been a little bit crazy. And it was a totally excellent childhood. It was utterly feral and it was fabulous. But it's a really long way from Central Australia to Silicon Valley, where I've spent the last 25 years of my life. I ran away from home. It's a familiar story, I think, to many people in the room. I ran away from home, from Australia. I went to the United States. I went there for university. I stayed for post-grad. I ended up, in a very roundabout way, meeting a man in a bar in Palo Alto in 1998 after I'd finished my degree at Stanford. And he led me astray. No, not in the usual ways, in a much more boring way. He just asked me what I did. I said I was an anthropologist. He said, "What's that?" I said I studied people for a living. He asked why. I probably should have guessed at that point he was an engineer, but I said, well, you know, they're interesting. He said, what do you do with that? I said I was a professor, and then I didn't really want to talk to him anymore. But he tracked me down. He introduced me to a whole lot of people in Silicon Valley, and ultimately to a job at Intel, where my role was to put people back into the way we tell stories about technology and how we build new technologies. My job was to work out what made people happy, what frustrated them, what they wanted for themselves, their kids, their families, their communities, and how to use all of that information to drive the next generation of technology development. And I did that job one way or another until last year, when I was standing on that very stage there in Dingle. And right about that time, I was having a bit of an existential crisis about what I should do next and about where I wanted to go. And in some ways, being in Dingle and being part of a conversation about what it meant to be at the edges of things turned out to be a really important one for my thinking. Because that notion, that line out of Yeats about will the centre hold, or the centre won't hold, was for me really useful for framing what I wanted to do next. So since the last time I saw you, I've left Silicon Valley, I've moved home to Australia. I've kind of reverse migrated myself, really, when I think about it. And I have taken up a role as a professor in computer science and engineering at the Australian National University, which is Australia's only national university. It's located in a place called Canberra, which is somewhere I grew up. So I really have done this long circle around the globe to come back to the place that I was a kid in. Now, why is all of that relevant? Well, it's relevant partly to the theme of migration and to the circulation of ideas, but it's also relevant because of why I've come home and what I'm interested in pursuing. And that's the story I want to unpack a little bit for you now. Oh, but I need to say, because I know Eamon's in the room somewhere. Hey, Eamon, sorry. Also, Josh. Hi, Josh. You have to look after Eamon. Buy him a drink, because I would have done that. You should too. So, although I'm at the ANU, I'm also still at Intel, so I get to have both roles, which for me has been both an incredible privilege and kind of a joy. But it means that some of my favorite colleagues are in the room with you, so I wave at them too. But why did I go home, and what was it about that journey that's important, and what is it that I've been pursuing? So it turns out for the last 5 years, my job at Intel was to make sense of the future. I got to think about people, but I also got to think about where is technology going, what do we care about in that technology, and what will its future look like, both in terms of the technology itself, but in terms of regulation and government and public policy and cultural patterns. And for me, trying to stitch all of that together has been a really interesting exercise. And I got really struck in doing that about something that started to appear in all of the various bits of material that we were collecting at Intel. And what it started to suggest to me was that we were sitting at the beginning of something really new, that I'd just come through a 20-year cycle in the Valley of thinking about, well, what it meant for things to become digital, about how we thought about devices, about computers, about the internet and the web and mobile apps. And it was this very kind of clear, crisp story about where things were heading. And starting about 2 or 3 years ago, that story started to feel a little bit different. The future started to look like it wasn't just about devices and the internet, but it was about data, and about where data was taking us, and about what it meant to imagine a world where data was the thing that computers did, whether they stored it, captured it, circulated it, made sense of it. We started talking about things again like artificial intelligence and machine learning and deep learning, and we were having lots of conversations about big data and the Internet of Things. And I started to wonder if all of that stuff went together, and that if it went together, what did it tell us about where the future was going, and how would you make sense of it? And it's that sense-making that I want to talk about for about the next 35 minutes, and then if the technology gods are willing, I will turn up on a screen and we will have a conversation live so you can ask me some questions about my craziness. That also means, in good Irish tradition, and Philip, I'm looking at you, I want to tell some stories. And these are stories about our past that I think are a way of making sense of where our future is going. And for me, it all starts with this chart. The World Economic Forum published this graph in it's about 18 months ago now, nearly 2 years ago. They entitled it The 4 Waves of Industrialization, and it's this really, in some ways, nice, neat, tidy chart. I mean, it's great, right? It basically explains the last 200 years of history of technology, and there it all is. It seems incredibly straightforward. Now, those of you who know me well should know that I have some significant problems with this chart. And were I in the room, I'd be going, what do you reckon my biggest problem is? And someone in the room would know. So we'll pause and you can guess. What do you reckon my biggest problem is with this chart? You're right. It is, in fact, that there are no people in this graph. And it tells the entire history of the last 250 years just by bits of technology. It also does this piece of work where what it does is tidy up the past. It says if you look at the history of the last 250 years, give or take, we can divide it into 4 easy moments. And that each one of those moments is characterized by a couple of pieces of technology. And of course, what that story doesn't tell you is what it felt like, what it meant for our work, for our families, for our artistic and our creative souls, what it meant for our countries, what are the unintended consequences of what it created in terms of movements of people and ideas and stuff, what it meant for the creation of new ideas and new social forms, the ways in which we resisted that technology, and the stuff we did with it. And so what I want to do is unpack that chart and tell you some stories about our past as a way of thinking about where I think our future is going. And I want to start with that first one, that one that says mechanization, water, and steam power. Because really what you should think about is that is the first wave of the Industrial Revolution. You learnt about this in high school. You have not thought about it since. We are now going to have a bit of a think about that first wave of industrialization, because something really interesting happens in it. And it's this first moment when we actually have to think about managing technology as a system. So what do I mean by that? Well, effectively, technology goes from being a steam engine over here, which was a discrete thing, steam engine, to being a train, to being a railway, to being a transportation system. And somewhere in that span from steam engine to transportation system, you end up with the individual pieces of technology not being as important as the whole it creates. But it also creates all these really interesting challenges. The guys that were really good about thinking about metal under heat and pressure were not the same people who were going to think about how did you make literally the trains run on time, and also the people who thought about should you put a train track up that hill, or who do I sell a ticket to, and will I need to advertise that railway system, and we can't get railway standard time, so how are we going to think about that? Because it turns out in that process of moving from engines to systems, we created new possibilities for knowledge and new challenges. The technology became a system, but it also got abstracted. And in that abstraction, there were all these new questions about integration of technical systems, about safety, about scale, about regulation. And there was this moment in time where it created a new set of possibilities. One of those very first moments happened in France in 1794. In the late end of 1794, right about now actually, when a place called the École Polytechnique was started in Paris. Some of you will know that name. Turns out it's the first school of engineering in the world. And it turns out the reason it came into being is really important. So in 1793, in the middle of the French Revolution, the King of France was executed. And it started a 2-year reign of terror, as it is sometimes called, in which many things happened in France. There was a move to secularize the calendar. There was a move to decenter the priesthood and their control on the movement of goods and services and roads. There was a move to establish a new sort of authority and a new system of control. There was also a decentralization of many systems that had existed before. And you have this sort of moment in time at the birth of a brand new democracy and a democratic institution where a lot of questions got asked about who were going to be the experts and what would those experts look like. And the École Polytechnique was created in response to that. It was created as a school. We would now think of it as a university. It had an early curriculum that was a blend of theory and practice, so hands-on and theoretical learning. It brought together some of the key thinkers of the day who were from the physical sciences, so mathematicians, physicists, chemists, people who thought about sort of the rules of the world. And it also brought together philosophers, logicians, people who thought about the human condition. And the idea was to build a new way of thinking and a new kind of person, someone who was grounded in the realities of the physical, knowable world, and someone who could ask big questions. And when you think about the problem statement, we're building a new democracy, we need to have a class of people who are going to help shepherd it into existence. That's a wonderful starting point. Those people are what we now think of as engineers. The first product of the École Polytechnique was a class of engineers who helped reconfigure the French transportation system, the road system, who helped build bridges, who helped standardize the movement of goods and services. In that way, which will be a shock to some of the engineers in the room, you have to remember your profession was a radical act. And it was associated with this first moment of working out how do we control a world when we don't have these systems that we've had in place for, well, at that point, thousands of years. Now, engineering looks really different in other places in the world. That École Polytechnique system, the Polytechnic system, it spreads, ironically, to America. That's actually how West Point gets started. It's what MIT is built on. It spreads across the rest of continental Europe. But in England, something very different happens. In England, engineering comes up through companies. It comes up through companies built by people who were making pieces of that first industrial revolution. Smeaton, Maudsley, Brunel, and a few others. And you went to one of those companies and you became an apprentice. And you didn't learn through theory, you learned through practice. You made things inside that company. Now, of course, over time, that meant that you only had people who were Brunel's boys and Smeaton's boys and Maudsley's boys, so there needed to be a standardized system. And the Society for Civil Engineers was born, who certified people across those companies. The first schools that taught engineering in England didn't really start until the early 20th century. So why am I telling you that story about engineers, right? Well, part of it is because that first wave of the Industrial Revolution, that first set of technologies, demanded a new way of thinking about the world. And there were different people who heard that call. In some places it was governments, it was universities, it was companies. And all of them looked at this new technical system and said, okay, we need some new ways of thinking. And of course, we have engineers with us today, and there are lots of different kinds: civil, mechanical, military, people who work in electrical engineering, optical systems. I mean, it is an incredibly rich space and continues to be one because that kind of system continues to require administration and continues to require people who know how to think about it at scale and with abstraction and with safety. One of the other things that happened, though, was those systems made possible the second wave of the Industrial Revolution. So think back to that graph with the 4 waves. First wave is steam engines. Second wave is about mass production. So we go from humans building technology that let them kind of move things faster, move themselves faster, do things at scale, to this second wave of technology that let us do that even more. So think about the introduction of basically the production line, of the first wave of automation. That let us as humans create a whole new way of moving goods and services around. It also had this other really unexpected, and in some ways not entirely unintended consequence, but an unexpected consequence, that it allowed people to become wealthy in a way that hadn't existed before. It was no longer about owning one factory, it was about owning a chain of factories. It wasn't just about having a thing you built, it was basically you started to be able to own pieces of other people's factories. You started to have this basically accumulation of money. And a man named Joseph Wharton, who was a Philadelphia Quaker, he was an industrialist. And in 1881, he suddenly realized that he had a lot of money, and his accountant was really cross with him because he couldn't work out how to keep track of it. And so Joseph Wharton took $100,000 and he went to the president of the University of Pennsylvania and he went, hey, can you build me a better bookkeeper? If I give you $100,000, can you give me a better bookkeeper? Now, of course, the president of the University of Pennsylvania, not being a silly man, went, yeah, I'll take your money and I'll build you something. And he took a step back and said, well, actually, Joseph Wharton's not the only person who's asking this question. And the industrialists of Philadelphia are operating on a scale we've never seen before. And I actually think this represents a system change. And so he assembled a bunch of smart people inside his university, economists, early behavioral psychologists, people who thought about mathematics, philosophers. Turns out philosophers are actually the answer to every question, you just didn't know that yet. As well as some people who did early sort of sociology and then a little bit of the law. And he said, and he got the accountants too because he didn't want to leave them out. He said, okay, gentlemen mostly, can you help us build a different way of thinking about money? I don't think it's about more dual entry bookkeeping. I actually think it's a different way of thinking about money. And you've got a little while to go do it. So these guys go off and they have a bit of a think and they start to realize that what they are contemplating here is a system. This is about a whole new way of thinking about the relationship between money, profit, the economy, ideas of thinking about banking, ideas about thinking about the health of the economy. And ultimately what they build is a new curriculum. And they open a school that we now know as the Wharton School of Business. And at the time it was the first business school in the world. And the thing it produced was businessmen, in quotes, right? It produced businessmen, people who knew how to think about business as a system. And over time, the Wharton School also produced a whole lot of other things that you hear about all the time. Economists at that school made the GDP. Didn't make it. They created it as a metric of thinking about economic success. They also worked out how to think about options and shares. They theorized labor relationships. They were responsible for creating the first theories about branding and marketing. And of course, they weren't the only people to think about these things, right? Business schools turned up at Harvard and Berkeley and in all other kinds of places in the world. And all kinds of ideas about how to think about money as a system and how to think about capital as a system and how to measure it became tools we all encounter every day. It also became one of the first places that we connect ideas about productivity and the health of an economy. And when we start to move into thinking about the way you measure a society is through its economic health, not its cultural health, not its holistic well-being, not its artistic production. So there are some significant complications to this kind of worldview, but it emerges as this second wave of industrialization. Sure, it was about mass production and, production lines like in this photo, but it was also about changing those ideas about what made a society healthy and successful. That notion and that idea of managing systems continues through the 20th century. And by the 1940s, it turns out that a new set of technology appears. It's the third wave of industrialization. A new set of technologies appear that start to, again, change the way as humans we think about systems, but also the way as humans we can manage the systems. And that third wave is about the appearance of computers. So the first computers, I'm sure as many of you know, because you remember Ada from last year, right? The first computers were mathematicians. They're actually people. There was a moment in time when if you said something was a computer, you were actually referring to a human being who tabulated stuff. And mostly, in World War II, those computers were women. So in fact, when we talk about computers, they were in fact human women mathematicians. Computers don't become technical systems until the very end of World War II. And in those early days, they're just computers. I mean, they're expensive and loud and big and really not very compelling. But by the 1950s, computers have gotten smaller, they've gotten faster, they're capable of doing more than calculations, they're starting to be able to, again, abstract things. And by the 1960s, computers have gotten much smaller, they have scaled out, and there are companies who are producing them en masse and selling them to all kinds of organizations. If you had a payroll in the 1960s in a big company, chances are it was being managed by a computer. If you had a supply chain system, it might have been managed by a computer. If you were doing anything in scientific research, there was a computer somewhere and a stack of punch cards that were working it through, right? If you were a university, somewhere lurking in a basement, there was a computer. And if you were the United States government, there were computers everywhere. Every government department had a computer doing something. But here's the rub, right? The thing about computers in the 1960s, there were only a couple of companies who produced them, and each company had a proprietary software system that sat on top of that computer. So if you had an IBM computer, you had Fortran, because that was their programming language. If you had GE or RAND, you had Phlegmatic into COBOL. That was their programming language. And there wasn't a capacity to think about how to manage those computing resources outside of those proprietary software systems. And for a couple of people who had a lot of computers, in particular the United States government, there was a moment of going, uh-oh, Yeah, okay. So here's the thing. We have a lot of computers, and we have one programming system and one company. And that starts to feel a bit like a critical failure path, because in order to get someone who can program it, we have to get them who can only program in Fortran, and they come from IBM. And yeah, some people teach that programming, but mostly it's IBM. And for the government, and in particular for a couple of departments in the government, that felt like a problem that might need a different kind of solution. And so there was a moment in the early 1960s when some mathematicians in the United States, so people who at that point were already working with computers and working on programming, were asked to build a new way of thinking about computers. The request was, could you build us a programming language that sat above Fortran and COBOL, and that let us think about these systems at a more abstract level, that would let us start to manage those resources differently. The person that got approached was a man named George Forsyth, who was a professor of mathematics at Stanford University, my old alma mater. And the request was, George, can you build something that would just be different than all of this? George said, an interesting request. So he assembles some of his mates from around the traps. And for basically 2 years, they go out trying to work out what would it look like to build a language that sat above these programs, like to basically have a science of computers. And in that group, there are mathematicians, physicists, linguists, oh, and you guessed it, philosophers, who specialized in logic. And they sat around for a long time trying to work out what would the pieces be of a computer science? What would you need to know? Well, you'd need to know the architecture of computers, but you'd also need to start to understand the grammar of programs. You'd need to think about how mathematics works and how logic works. And they build out these building blocks of a curriculum. And in 1968, they take that document, the curriculum, they go to the annual meetings of the Association of Computer Machinery. So basically the people who worked with computers had a meeting. And they take this document and they go, right, here's the thing, we've built you a curriculum for computer science. Here it is, take it. And much to my kind of collective astonishment, everyone at this meeting went, that's great, thanks. They all took it home to their institutions and started teaching computer science classes. Now, the reason I find that astonishing, and I'm willing to bet there are some people in the room, Philip, who are from the creative sector. Imagine in your field if someone turned up at some meeting that you had of your profession and went, hey, I've had an idea about how we should all teach the thing we all do, and here it is, just go off and implement it. In anthropology, we can't agree in one university how to teach anthropology, let alone agreeing across all the universities in the world. But to this absolute credit of computer scientists, they went, great, now we have a single language, or at least a single vocabulary, we'll go off and implement it. And that's how it's been ever since. Computer science is still, in some ways, a shared view about what it means to talk about and manage machinery. And computer scientists and their work have let us scale out what computing does in remarkable ways. They're the people who have brought us things like artificial intelligence, as well as architectures of everything from laptops to the phones that you are currently using while you are listening to me, or the laptop that you're watching this on, right? They helped build that whole world, and they helped create a new way by which we could control and manage machinery. So 3 waves of the Industrial Revolution, right? That first wave about steam engines, the second wave about mass production and money, the third wave about computers. Each one of those waves has a familiar feel to it, right? It's about individual pieces of technology getting to be a system, where that system is characterized by an abstraction away from the underlying technologies, and where at each point the impulse, whether it's by an institution, a government, a company, a university, the impulse is to find a way to put humans in control. So how do we manage the system, right? How do we make the trains work? How do we ensure that they run safely? Well, you know, a human driver, a human regulator. How do we circulate money? We create rules for it. How do we think about computers? We architect them. At each point, it was this piece where it was physical systems that we had a command and control relationship to. And that's been, in some ways, the last 250 years. I mean, crassly put, and if you're a historian, I apologize for what I've just done to your discipline, but you know, that's basically the arc of it. What is really interesting is moving forward, it starts to feel a little bit different. So on that World Economic Forum chart, that 4th wave of industrialization, the one they say we're in now, is characterized by, quote unquote, cyber physical systems. That's a complicated label. and it's hard to think about what's lurking inside of it, right? I think what's lurking inside of cyber-physical systems is a label. IoT, big data, algorithms, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all those pieces, right? And they start to feel more and more like a system. But here's the really interesting thing. I'm not convinced they're a system like all those other systems. I'm not convinced that cyber-physical systems will be the same as the waves that came before. So I think there are some ways in which it is profoundly different than what we have seen before, and as a result, it's both a challenge and a really big opportunity. Because what if it's the case that that whole constellation of things, that cyber-physical system, it changes where humans sit in all of it. And because of the fact that what is running through it is data, I wonder if it doesn't raise a really different set of questions. Maybe it's not about us managing the machines. Maybe it's about the moment where the machines will manage the machines. Maybe it's about the fact that all that data makes it possible, I mean, for want of a better word, to automate the automation, where machinery and software and systems have the capacity to make decisions, enact solutions, carry forth work without humans in the equation at all. And that what we are looking into is the end of a command and control infrastructure and the beginning of something very different. And if that is true, there are some really interesting consequences that start to emerge out of it. Now, at the moment, we have talked about that world that is coming as being about artificial intelligence. So the notion that we'll be able to build some kind of system that is smart. We talk about being able to teach it, or it will ultimately teach itself, which is what machine learning is about. The idea that you can give a software tool a lot of data and it will work out what the patterns are and learn how to handle them over time. We talk about autonomous technologies, so the notion that technologies will propel themselves, for want of a better word. We have a lot of kind of speculations about what that place looks like. I think it turns on just 3 ideas, and I think they're all worth paying a little bit of attention to, right? So if this 4th wave is cyber-physical systems and the thing it turns on is data, so, you know, the steam engine was the Industrial Revolution 1, data is the Industrial Revolution number 4, I think there's some really interesting questions we need to ask, right? And the first one is, well, what do we mean by autonomy in that sense? What do we mean by automated? What do we mean by the system will manage itself? Well, sitting inside all of that, there's always this really interesting semantic moment where you go from talking about autonomous vehicles on the one hand to self-driving cars on the other. And on the one hand, those reasonably sound like the same thing. Autonomous vehicle, self-driving car. Self-driving car is just a bit more user-friendly as a term, right? But the challenge is, as soon as you say self-driving car, at one level you assert that the car has a self. And if the car has a self, what does that mean? And does that mean that when we talk about things being autonomous, the only way we know how to talk about them, in English I guess, is by assuming that autonomous is the same as sentient? Is autonomous the same as achieving consciousness? If a thing is autonomous, does that mean it's self-contained and in fact it has a self? And all of those are, well, guess what? Those are philosophical questions, not just technical questions. But they're also questions that encode, well, a set of values. We talk about self-driving cars, and in some ways we immediately preclude the couple of things. One is that those cars, those vehicles may be autonomous, but they're going to sit inside a technical infrastructure, a networked infrastructure where data flows, so they're self-contained, but they're connected to a network. Sure, they're autonomous, but they'll need data, they'll need a network, they'll need power, they'll need a clearly defined structure and system through which they move. So autonomous tends to make us think, self-contained. But the reality is there's this whole ecosystem around it that we're going to need to think about. And cars is always a good example, right? An autonomous vehicle will need a data network. It'll need a capacity to move and store data as well as analyze it locally. It will also need a clearly defined road so that it knows where the road ends and where it begins. All of those sort of sit outside that system, but are part and parcel of what it would mean to be autonomous. But it's also the case that some of those technologies might be more interesting if they're collective. So autonomous but collective. Conscious but group consciousness. Do we look to biological metaphors and we think about flocking swallows or swarms of bees or pods of dolphins, things that communicate with each other where they are better together than apart? That'll be a very different way of thinking about technology. At the moment, we design most technical objects to be singular. We're building a radio stack so it can talk to something else, but the expectation is your phone is by itself. It's not running around hoping to find its phone friends so that it can be better together. But some of these technical systems, that might be the case. All of which means there are questions we should ask when we use the word autonomous and we think about this future, right? I also think, as a social scientist, there's some really messy territory sitting inside autonomy about how it is that humans think about granting things autonomy. We have in the arc of my lifetime granted certain kinds of other humans limited autonomy, whether that was children, women, ethnic others. We have some very weird ways we use that phrase, right, of autonomy. So when we talk about the machinery running itself, what do we really mean by that? Is it a self and will it be singular? How will that get managed? All of which has big technical implications, but also huge ones in terms of a regulatory world. And a sort of a world of how we think about those things. Second set of questions are about, so okay, the machines are managing the machines. The automated are automated. You know, it's automated itself. What are the limits on that? Like, at what point do we say, no, so you can drive by yourself to Kerry, but you can't go to Dublin. Like, where's the limit? You can go up the coast, but not too far. Only 100 kilometres before you have to stop. How do we decide what effectively the agency is? What are the limits that that object has on itself, has before it has to check back in? And how do we manage that line, right? How do we decide how far a technical object gets to be before it has to check in with us? And who gets to make that decision and which us is it checking in with? This is not unlike in your family where it's the what things do you ask mum about versus what things do you ask dad about, because you know you're going to get different answers. Technical objects have the capacity to think about whose authority supersedes what authority. You could well imagine that an object built in one country may do better in a different country because it has a capacity to think about what is the rule set. We have colleagues at Google who've been building little tiny travel systems to negotiate for plane tickets. So a tiny little, basically, autonomous agent that runs around on the internet getting you a plane ticket. First time this was experimented with, they built 3 versions of it, so 3 prototypes. They trained one on negotiation skills using chess. They trained one on negotiation skills using Go, the Chinese strategy game. And they trained one of them on Call of Duty, so the single-person shooter game. Now, you can well imagine when push comes to shove and you really need to get a plane ticket, like quickly, you know which one of those travel bots is going to be best. The answer is the one trained on Call of Duty. Now, of course, the reality is no one wants to deal with that one again afterwards. So we have this interesting problem, right? If we grant the machinery the capacity to manage itself, what are the rules of the road it is using? What data is it trained on? How does it think about the world? What are its instincts? And how do we have visibility into those? Because it's one thing to say, well, I've got this travel bot. It's another thing if that travel bot has a worldview that you don't have any visibility into knowing, you don't know what its value system is. And how will we regulate those things? How will the system be able to say to us, hi, I'm your friendly travel negotiation system, and you can have 3 choices. What do you want me trained on? How will the system know to talk about those things, and how will we build them? How will we think about what the right limits are? And importantly, how will we do the really hard work of negotiating between the object and human beings? Because it turns out, for as much as we've been talking about artificial intelligence, we probably should have been talking about cybernetics or cyber-physical systems. How do we negotiate the life where certain things we do have been, I don't know, in some ways replaced by machinery. Not everything we do, but certain things, certain tasks, better done by machines. Turns out artificial intelligence engines are much better at reading pathology scans for melanomas than a human being. And having that done is a wonderful thing. You might still want to talk to a doctor about what your course of treatment should be. And how we think about that negotiation, humans negotiating with machinery, humans negotiating with other humans about the machinery, and frankly the machinery negotiating with each other, maybe about us, but possibly not. All of that is part and parcel of some of the questions we have to address in the future. And then last but by no means least, in my kind of, I think one of the biggest questions about what it's going to be in a world where the machines can automate themselves is how do we think about safety and risk and liability and trust? The whole bundle of things I'm calling assurance here. How do we think about all of those things? How do we manage them? How do we think about where they sit in different countries? I can tell you the technology built in America doesn't always work in Australia. I'm willing to bet that technology built in Britain doesn't always work in Ireland. I'm willing to bet things built in Ireland may not always work in Egypt. Because it turns out culture matters here, right? How we think about safety, regulation, trust, those are cultural things too. So how are we going to manage all of that world? So that's a lot of stories and a lot of questions, right? That's me saying, I think the world that's coming will feel really different than the one we've been through. But the one we've been through gives us the right questions to ask. Who's driving the change? How do we control it? What's the system that's being built? And what are the ways we should respond to it institutionally? What are the things we need to do as educators, as technologists, as creators? How do we respond to all of that? So I said at the beginning, a year ago, I stood on this stage and I was trying to work out what I was going to do next. And I realized what I wanted to do next was answer those questions. And so I went home to a university where I thought I could do that, a little bit away from the center that's producing all that technology, with just a little bit of critical distance so I could ask some questions about it. And as of 2 months ago, we created a new initiative here at the Australian National University to start trying to answer those questions. So I have a new venture. I'm now the director of an institute. The institute is called the 3A Institute for Autonomy, Assurance and Agency. And my commitment to the university and to my boss who's in the room right there now is that I'm going to build a new science. I'm going to build the next computer science, the next business, the next engineering. I'm going to build a set of questions and a way of thinking and hopefully a curriculum that will build us the people who'll manage the world when the machines can manage themselves. And yeah, I know, crazy, right? I mean, I've obviously lost my mind. That's a fairly big thing to decide you're going to do. Put my hand up and said, yes, I'm going to build a new applied science. But the reality is I think we need to do it. I think there is a moment it needs to happen. And I think it's hugely important that it be done by someone whose feet are firmly planted in two camps. I may not be an engineer, but I've spent 20 years with them, and I was raised by them. My dad's an engineer, and so are both of my grandparents. But in my heart and soul, I am an anthropologist. My fundamental starting point is always human beings. And I think if you want to build a science that will help us manage in a world where the machines are managing themselves, you're going to need to start with that. And then you're going to need to pull in computer scientists and engineers and anthropologists and sociologists and economists and psychologists and artists and creators and of course philosophers. And that somewhere in that whole space what we'll build is a new way of being in the world and a new way of seeing the world. And I hope you'll let me come back next year and tell you a whole lot more about it. So with that, I want to say thank you again for having me. I'm sorry I can't be there. And I'll get to see you all soon. Bye.
So talk about unconstrained thinking in terms of sitting back and setting up institutions, structures, networks to think about the future and imagine the future. We're very grateful to Genevieve for that recording. She had fully intended to be here with us, but before she managed to get on her plane, other personal matters intervened. So she got herself into that studio and did that recording, and she's now going to join us in a few minutes. and we're very grateful for that. In terms of the self-indulgent bit that I spoke about earlier, one of the things that this gathering up allows me to do is reach out to certain people and say, I've been following your work for ages. Would you come and speak with us at Dingle? And this woman is one such of those. This is Dr. Nora Niledon. We're delighted that she's here with us this morning. She's a lecturer in law. She's also the director of the Information Law and Policy Centre at the University of London. She's also affiliated at King's College London, at the University of Johannesburg. She received her PhD at the University of Cambridge, where she was immersed in the interdisciplinarity of which Genevieve just spoke. Her own research interests are in governance, human rights, digital data protection, and government surveillance. She also has a special interest at where all this comes together on the front lines with regards to children and privacy. Prior to her academic career, she was an officer at the Office of the Director at Public Prosecutions here in Ireland. She also clerked in the Irish Supreme Court. She's a graduate of NUIG. And when we sat back to think about who we could have to chat to Genevieve, we couldn't possibly, and we didn't. And we couldn't have found anybody else better to do it. So Nora, you're very welcome. Thank you for being with us. And I believe the technology is now going to cut across. Hi, Genevieve.
Hi, I'm terrified of you, Nora.
That's how everyone feels about lawyers at first, but we're actually quite nice once you get to know us. Genevieve, thank you so much for such a fascinating overview of all the waves of the Industrial Revolution, and I think so many of the points that you raised are just so pertinent to so many of the conversations we'll have for the rest of the festival here. But a lot of the very important policymaking questions that are happening all over Europe and North America and throughout the world in terms of where is this data taking us? What kind of society do we want to be living in going forward? And when I was listening to your talk, I mean, you just covered so many different topics, and I think it was very, very useful in that we get so caught up in the moment. And it's very good to have that historical perspective as to, who's driven the changes so far, the different developments, particularly the issues and challenges of having monopolies and having this power dynamic between public institutions, the academic institutions, the private sector. And I think the points that you made regarding, say, the building of the business system at the Wharton School of Business, the fact that you had an interdisciplinary approach there, and so important to see the kind of influence that that's had going forward. So in terms of an ongoing theme, I just saw through your presentation for the 4 waves, in terms of the values that seem to be underpinning this technological determinism, it just seems to be innovation, innovation, innovation. And innovation is such an important value in society, but it kind of then makes me wonder, do you think that mantra pervading in Silicon Valley of moving fast and breaking things, do you think that's always been there for the past 200 years? Or do you think there's been this seismic change? Or do you think it's something that's actually been accelerating from the 3rd wave now moving into the 4th wave?
Listen, I think that's a really good question. And I think one of the challenges in that is that as we move from physical objects into software objects, it made it easier to go faster and faster. And the idea of breaking things seemed less troubling than it was if you were breaking a train than breaking a piece of code. Those have a different kind of consequence to it. I think one of the real challenges as we move into that 4th wave, whatever we're calling it, cyber-physical systems, data-driven world, the challenge is that some of the ways we've driven innovation no longer look sensible. If we're talking about an algorithm that has material consequences for access to goods or services or medical systems or a national boundary, it's a very different thing to say, we'll just build it in beta, we'll send it out, you can iterate it, and as we fix it, we'll update it. And that kind of notion of how innovation happens has become quite enshrined over the last 30 years as a kind of almost co-collaborative dance between companies and consumers. And there's certainly an argument to make with some of the technical objects that will get created now that doesn't work. And that we should look to, I think, some of the regulatory regimes out of things like medicine, where we say, actually, it's got to be tested here and then go through multiple phases of testing before we release it to have real life consequences. And so one of the challenges here is that because we are so used to thinking that innovation means build it fast, break it off, and iterate, we're not good at thinking about why some of these objects will actually require profound regulation and thoughtfulness and possibly containment before general release.
So I think a lot of the points that you raised there makes me think a lot of what I think a lot of data privacy in lawyers in Europe are thinking about right now, and probably elsewhere, which is a lot of the major reforms happening in data protection law in Europe next year with the General Data Protection Regulation. And that's going to give people stronger rights. It's going to give data protection authorities, those enforcement bodies, greater powers of sanction, for example, and overview. And it's seen as, and then by extension, the other side of that coin is that for businesses and governments, there are more responsibilities and more obligations. And this seems to make sense because it's in tandem with the point that you made about the fact that it's all about data. It's all about data now. It's so pervasive, its collection, its analysis, its sharing, its reuse, for example. And in thinking about this, the question is very much one of, well, right now we seem to be dealing with this in the sense of we have data, we have the humans, and then we have the interaction. But how do you think we get to a place where the focus is on the humans, how we interact with the data? How do we bring everyone together to have that different way of thinking, that HDI by design approach?
Yeah, gosh, it's such a good question, Maura. And in some ways, this is a place where I actually find myself returning back to the theoretical work that was done in the 1930s and 40s about what it meant to imagine the relationship between computers, biological systems, and human systems. And for theorists like Norbert Wiener and Paul Shannon and Lang, they really were imagining that the hardware wasn't making the computers smart, it was about how humans would negotiate through those objects and what it would mean for human societies. And I think one of the challenges has been, as we've talked a lot about AI over the last 5 years, is that's really made a fetish of the machinery. And we spend a lot of time talking about the artificially intelligent machines and the data. And we don't do such a good job of thinking about where are the people in all of this, and more to the point, not just people as consumers, but people as citizens and control carriers, basically. Because frankly, what some of the answers are going to be will look different places. So, I mean, my sort of suspicion is how do we get to a human system here requires some very different interventions, very different.
Okay, so there is...
And possibly a better.
Okay, so there is a slight delay on our side. I feel like the computers are listening in. They're beginning to disrupt. Skynet's very aware. So let me know if you can... okay, there we go. Excellent. Okay, good response. So just to go back to the very important point you made about the fact that, look at this, look at these 4 waves of technological revolution and look what's missing. Where is the societal impact? Where are the roles in humans in this process? This is a very nice, neat package of how history's been developing. So in terms of describing it somewhat differently, the focus of humans interacting with the internet and data and devices more generally, with Web 1.0, it was the internet all over the world. We all got to connect. And that was the utopian perception of the internet. It was going to change everything and to be the equalizer among societies. And then with Web 2.0, we had social media. So we wouldn't just receive information, but we'd also develop it and share even more. And now we have what some people are describing as Web 3.0. And we have what you talked about earlier on in the fourth wave. We have the Internet of Things. We have artificial intelligence. But we've already been having a really good indication of how wrong the use of these technologies can go, for example. So we've seen it in terms of how it's affected national elections. We've seen it in terms of fake bots and the fact that it's no longer about censoring information and holding information back, but about overloading people with false information. And we've gotten ourselves into this situation of, say, the internet of fake things. So in terms of the humans who can play a significant role in addressing these gaps between, well, it can't just be innovation that we're prioritizing. Who do you see as the key stakeholders to take us from this third wave moving into the fourth wave?
I mean, I think it's the usual collection in some ways of suspects. So governments, but also educational institutions, but also public sort of and private sector intersection. But I also think, as I often think, some of the most interesting stuff that is happening here is going to happen at a different scale. So whether it is what's going on at the community level with community activism, but also with the creation of new forms of art and creativity. Right? I mean, I think, watching some of the ways that people are starting to push what you can do with data to make new forms of expression, also what you can do with data to start to track different sorts of social activities and manage it. There's been an interesting set of analysis going on here in Australia looking at the application of government research grants and who gets those grants as a way to start to say, how do we think about including more voices there? So in fact, using data to reflect back on ourselves about where we should do a better job of changing the conversation. And I think it's an interesting way of starting to think about where does data go and how do you use it to drive change. And frankly, some of the stuff around citizen science, so whether it is some of the experiments that are happening here in Sydney of using the renting bike system, so the kind of all the various bike systems, and adding sensors for environmental pollution to each one of those bikes so that in fact what they become part of as a citizen science project as well as a transportation engine, the pollution becomes a really different thing. Who are going to be the actors in all of this and what will be the action?
So in terms of... So in terms of how actors have been... So in terms of how actors have been interacting so far, this is coming across the door. Machines are taking over. Computer says no. In terms of actors in this space...
They don't like the women talking to each other.
I think a major concern for policymakers in dealing with developments in technology and ensuring that we have everyone involved, the public, artists, the technology sector, civil society, academia, there is a huge push to have this engagement. But at the same time, as you just mentioned in terms of academia, we still have these silos. In business, in academia, people are still operating quite differently and often not communicating. And in terms of the societal impact, in terms of what the implications of these devices and technology and the data sharing and AI is going to have on society, that is often an afterthought. And I think in terms of what you've established with the institution of the 3 A's, I think that's just the most fantastic step forward in the right direction, that you have this hub, just like you have events like Other Voices, that are bringing all of these different relevant parties together who all play a role. But where do you see the role for individuals and public engagement with centres like this in the future, and how they interact with the tech industry and public institutions, particularly regarding the growing relationship between public institutions and the tech industry, where you have so much exchange of data in smart cities, in those self-driving cars, in all the automated ways in which we'll be connected? To what extent do we empower individuals? I mean, there's education, but when we say education, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. This is what we lawyers do, like to operationalize things. Do we do it in the sense that we need to rethink our curriculums in terms of how we teach computer science? We talked about an applied computer science. I mean, do we need to instill that from children from the primary school level?
All good questions. I think in some ways part of the answer is about how we think of what is it we're trying to get done, right? It's really tempting sometimes to think technology in society in ways that society is not already sort of embarking on itself. So how we think about empowered individuals is for me partly how we think about changing some of the language we use. So a language we move from talking about people as consumers to reclaim it about and what are the mechanisms that we have and places we have to manage through the when we're thinking about schooling, I think you have to push all the way back into primary school. And I think it's not just about how do we teach kids to code, because frankly, whatever you taught them in primary school would not be relevant at the point they graduate high school 12 years later. That mechanism, that language will be long irrelevant. Teaching them about the architecture of a program or the architecture of an algorithm, those things will scale and endure. But I also think there's a need to be focusing on what increasingly I think of as critical thinking skills. So how do we know how to ask, where does an idea come from? Whose idea is it? Who benefits from it? What are the consequences of it? And who are the winners and sometimes losers? Are all part of how we ought to have conversations, not just about abstract things, but about technical objects and about what we teach kids in schools is part and parcel about how do you develop people who know how to ask the right questions, not know how to build something to a particular piece of code that may go out of fashion or out of capacity. So if there were things that we think about changing, part of them are about addition. Yes, it's about digital literacy, but it's actually about the civility. I think there's a very strong argument made that one of the challenges and the unintended consequences of those 3 waves of industrialization is that it made us think that the sole role of technology is to increase productivity and efficiency. And we start to think that a good society is a society that has a relatively stable, GDP or some sort of productivity measure. And frankly, I think there are ways to argue that what we should be thinking about is a more holistic measure, which means as we think about how do you empower people in the future, it's not just about their technical skills, it's also about their skills as citizens, but also as cultural being. So, how do we think about the reform, the humanities, the social sciences, law, not just as feeders into STEM, but as standalone contributors to society?
So, Genevieve, I think that constitutes another call to arms in terms of the return to or the embracing of a broader set of critical thinking skills, the inclusion of more people in the conversation. This is a conversation that we're going to be taking up for the rest of the day, and Nora is actually going to be coming back on the panel later on this afternoon to develop some of those themes in greater depth. We're going to say good evening to you in Australia. Thank you very much for joining us. It's hugely appreciated. We know in terms of what you had to rearrange to do this, so we're very grateful. And you may be reassured to know that what we're going to do now is in the distinctly human and analogue form of the world. We're going to be, it's a day for the Murrins. We're going to be joined on stage now with Philip and another wonderful performer from this area, Murrin Nicauliv, and we are going very analogue. So appreciate it and thank you.